Shite, I'm sad we don't get to see you live and in person, but the motorcycle's nice.
Start my video.
There you go. Oh yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, you'll be like, turn it off. What are you doing?
Everyone knows James and I actually live pretty close together.
Yeah, that's why you also have waves and palm trees in your background.
That's right. I am not nearly as close though that Alina does. Oh, she's muted. She's muted.
What's that?
I'm not muted anymore. Hi. Yeah, Rich and I are neighbors.
Yeah, I can hop a fence and get to her house.
And you have.
How do you know that?
No, it's too high a fence. I can't do that. It's not that I'm not willing. It's just that I'm not able.
And he yells parkour when he does it.
Yeah. See how that works out for me.
If a dog was chasing you or something.
Yes, that's right. He's pulling a Ferris Bueller, jumping over all the.
Yeah, that's going to happen.
Fences.
Let's see. Why is it? Oh, I see. Okay, I got to push that button. Let's see see if this works. I'm going to share. Does anyone see it?
Yay!
Woo!
You're all good.
REST has totally wrecked microservices. And I hear we should stop doing Agile too.
Oh gosh.
Agile's still good.
Jeff, have you met Frank
drop
D'Andrea?
it. You should drop it. What? Who?
Frank D'Andrea.
No, I haven't.
I may have mentioned this when we were discussing the timing of your presentation, but he did a series of presentations called Scrum is Dumb.
Yeah, I had a fun podcast race recently for Software Engineering Radio. Some of you might be familiar with a guy named Jeremy Miller, created Structure Map, and Martin, which is a JSON database over PostgreSQL. And we did a podcast episode on waterfall versus Agile. And one of my favorite moments in that podcast episode was when he said, there was this wonderful show called Scooby-Doo and everybody loved it. And suddenly one day there came this character that ruined the lives of every Gen X kid. Every Gen X kid, their lives were ruined. And he said, Scrum is the Scrappy-Doo of Agile.
Here. I agree with that.
It's awesome.
All right. So just in case somehow you missed it, this is our presenter's name and his presentation title. And come on, PowerPoint, switch on me. There it goes. Okay. I'm sure everyone knows this by now, but here are the ways to find PadNug. Most importantly, Meetup, because that's where you find these meetings. The reason we exist is Microsoft made .NET, and Intel usually provides a great place for us to hang out and have these presentations. We may be back there someday. We'll see. Some of our supporters that make pizza possible when we meet in person. And a few
Remember pizza?
Remember pizza.
That'd actually be a great name for a pizza joint after COVID. Pizza Possible.
Here you go. Here's my rigatoni from No Millions tonight. So there you go. And no PadNug did not buy it. But anyway. So hey, we'll start at the top tonight. Alina, IT Motives. Don't forget to unmute.
I am unmuted, and guess what? I got some known Amelia, also the biggest calzone in the world. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's humongous. Woo! I also have my blazer shirt on, so I'm representing. I'm feeling the PadNug love, and it's just nice to be here with all of you. I will put my contact information in the chat in case anybody needs a recruiter. I know things are a little different, a little slow, but we are all a network, and if you want to talk or vent or just see what's going on, consider me a resource. Thanks, guys.
Excellent. Thank you. Danielle, Tech Systems.
Hey, everybody. We still have people hiring. Everything's gonna blow over very soon. So if you need a resource, just like Alina said, contact all of us. Never hurts to network and kind of just see what's out there and learn about the landscape. So I'm happy to see everybody. Going to be really happy to see everybody at Thursday Lion in a couple months, maybe 1 month. Next month, right?
We'll see. Unknown.
Okay.
Danielle, do you know when things are going to get back to normal?
Yeah, I know. I think it's May 26th.
She knows all, James. She's just keeping it secret, okay?
Oh, gosh.
Okay, well, and as I mentioned, I actually forgot to say it out loud before I introduced all these people, but they are able and likely putting their contact information into the Zoom chat window so that you can find them, or you can do a private chat in the Zoom chat window to any of these recruiter folk. Actually, you can do it to anybody. If you want to chat me up, I just may not see it very quickly. So there's that. Soft source, Lori, I know I've seen you.
You have seen me, Rich. Hi. Hi, Padnug. It's good to be back. I am Lori Hannon from Soft Source Consulting, and we are hiring. If you want to hear more about Soft Source, my 6th anniversary is coming up in a few weeks. So if we're LinkedIn, it may be telling you about that. I've already started hearing from people about that. If we aren't LinkedIn, I'll put that link out there for you to click on. We are a software engineering consultancy, and so we're generally looking for software engineers. So if you do a fair amount of C# or Java or Node, come talk to us. The different thing there are differences between SoftSource and some of our other contracting brethren that have to do with the way our business model works. So if you have ever been curious about that, or curious to dip your toe in consulting and haven't quite gotten there yet, talk to me about why I took the plunge and why I'm still here 6 years later. I'll put my email address and that link in the chat, and look forward to seeing you when we can actually get together.
Yeah. I almost hugged someone today. It was it makes me making me crazy here. Let's see. Did anyone see Charlie show up? Do not see him on the list. Is that, well, there's a Charles. That isn't, that's not the right one, is it?
Chuck is not here.
Yeah. Well, why don't we turn to you then, Andrew? And if you want to give him a side plug, he's done it for you. So he was even nice about it. That's the best part.
Charlie Phillips is a good guy. He owns Catapult Recruiting. Yeah, he's a good friend.
Yes.
We've known each other for a long time. Yeah, so I'm with Vanderhouen, and we've been in Portland for a long time, and have been hanging out with you at Padnug for many years. You know, things are very slow out there right now, but they're not dead. And we are still hiring, and there are still, you know, companies that are looking for good people. And so, yeah, I mean, any one of the recruiters here are great people, and we'd love to speak with you. Feel free to hit any one of us up. And I look very forward to seeing you guys in person, hopefully soon. That'd be great.
Indeed. Stephen Greger, Robert Half Technology.
Everybody, this is Stephen Greger with Robert Half Technology. Thanks all for coming in. So I'm from Robert Half Technology. We're the world's oldest and largest specialized staffing firm. And while things have slowed down significantly for all of us, as you may know, actually things have actually picked up a little bit here recently. We've had quite a lot of really cool projects pop up from some recent funding, and we'd love to introduce you to some of our clients that are currently looking for a few different software developers. Looking for two things right now. One would be a .NET developer for a short project that we're currently working on, as well as something that's a little bit longer. If anybody's got a good background in developing in Azure environments, give me a jingle after all this is done today. We've got a couple things we're working on that I'd love to introduce you to, talk to you about, and see if it would be a good fit for you. So enjoy the presentation, everybody.
Thank you very much. And I agree, Stephen, that we need a higher res version of your logo, and probably Vanderhouen also.
Yeah, I'm setting a reminder now to do it for tomorrow.
Because, yeah, I got to admit, sitting next to Catapult, they do look a little blurry, don't they?
On the projector, it's not so bad, but.
And honestly, I don't recall if Charlie gave me a raster or not. It might just be something that we blew up really huge and then captured it in high res. So let's see what else we got. We have some podcasts that might be worthy. In fact, I believe we had one or two of these last month when we were chatting. So here are a few podcasts that folks might want to check out.
Software Engineering Radio, Can you tell us a little bit about that, Rich?
Well, I think Jeff might be able to tell us more about it.
Yeah, but I'm not on yet.
Ah, true. You have that built into your presentation, do you?
Maybe.
Okay. Well, it is now. So there you go.
Trying to give you a cue.
Whoops. I think Carl's still doing dust shows, is he? Or has anyone checked that out lately? I forgot to drop this just in case, but there you go. So other stuff that's going on. Well, if somehow things open up, I'm not betting on it, but May 12th and I presume the 19th would be some geek dinners if things happen to open up. The former Oregon SQL group, Oregon Data Community, they are meeting a week after tomorrow. They do virtual presentations. Portland Azure Group, I just noticed as we were preparing this afternoon that they have a meetup scheduled for May 19th themselves. They haven't met for a while. And the East Side Geek Dinner, excuse me, I think I said that 2 weeks, that's 3 weeks from now. That one might happen. I don't know. That's far enough down. Maybe it'll be open by then. Then on the 28th is the SQL Server User Group, and we have Brian Kostanich. Kostanich? I always forget how he wants to say it. Planning on doing a NetDuino presentation in June. So stay tuned for that. I think that's it. And then we can introduce a speaker. Fewer slides these months without the live venue and such. Does anyone else have any notable announcements that they'd like to share with us? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Jeff, I think we're about ready to put you on live.
All right. Can everybody see my dark screen?
Yes. And folks, I think we'll probably, you might want to mute yourself for part of the presentation, but notice on the participants, over in the participants window, you can raise your hand and call attention to yourself that way. So
you can also type in everyone chat, or you can do a direct chat to me. There's a little drop down there to, you can pick a person if you want to have a private question. I'll try not to be too distracted though. I'm sure now Rich is going to heckle me incessantly while I'm trying to present. So I'll just ignore everything he says.
I plan to. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's what I do for every speaker. All right. Have a good one and enjoy. I'm going to mute myself now.
Awesome. Well, hey everybody. I am really excited to be here. I am a former Californian. So yes, I'm one of those. And I am so glad to be quarantined in place in East Portland and not in Central California, where it is already over 100 degrees. So I'm very glad we got out of there when we did. Just moved here back in November. So tonight you are here because we're going to talk about how REST wrecks microservices. And you're all muted, so I can't hear the screams and the shouts and the joy. So yeah, there's Rich. Thanks, Rich. So maybe you're thinking, wait, what? REST wrecks microservices. We use REST all the time, and they work really great for us in our microservices. What's the problem with REST? I have microservices that are RESTful. They work fine. Do you really? Are they really? I like to ask the provocative questions, and that's what we're going to do tonight. Is we're going to ask some provocative questions and explore some things. So a little bit about me before we get started, since I don't know a lot of you, or maybe you don't know about me. I started on computers back in the mid 80s. I took a programming class on a Commodore 64 in the 1980s. That was a lot of fun, programming basic. I graduated from college in the mid 90s with a major in business of all things. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life, as is true for most college graduates. And also, like most college graduates, I ended up doing something that had nothing to do with my degree after college. Although I guess you could argue that being a CTO of a startup has something to do with business. I've always been drawn to technology. I was on BBSs doing IceNet and ARPANET back in the 80s, again, dating myself, but some of you who've been around for a while know what I'm talking about, and you were using Y modem, Z modem, and all kinds of fun stuff with that. So in the early 2000s, I founded a software consultancy, and I served there as CTO until 2007. We made the transition from Java to .NET in about sorry, I saw the Commodore 64 comment and I derailed. We made the transition in about 2001, late 2001, when .NET was still in beta. We had a chance to evaluate whether we were going to stick with Java or switch to .NET, and we made the switch, and I've never regretted that. Java's come a long way, but I feel like .NET keeps outpacing it in many respects. So shout out to the Java devs. There's some great stuff happening over there in that community, but I'm definitely still a .NET fan. Founded a SaaS company in the ag tech space, and I served there as CTO until 2018. And currently I'm a senior software architect at Viewpoint Construction Software here in Portland, right by OMSI. Well, that's where I used to work, but now I work right here in my office at home, as do most of you. Not my office, your office. I've contributed to numerous open source projects, some maybe you've heard of, like Nancy FX, which is now defunct, unfortunately, but has been replaced by Carter. So if you liked the conventions you got for routing in your ASP.NET applications with Nancy, you can switch over to Carter. You can find that on GitHub. Also, one of the original contributors to Martin, along with Jeremy Miller. It's a data access layer over PostgreSQL that lets you treat PostgreSQL as a JSON data store. And Postgres has some really powerful capabilities for querying into JSON, and it does JSON indexing in a way that SQL Server hasn't quite caught up on yet. So that may be something you're interested in checking out. Recently, I've begun contributing to a project called Zamatech Project Plan, which is a cool project for helping you design your projects and then help you with your project managers to kind of walk through the project tracking task, and other ones as well. I'm a iDesign Master Architect. You can find out more about them at iDesign.net. They have classes and books available for you to also learn what it takes to become a Master Architect. I'm a host on Software Engineering Radio, along with about 10 other software professionals from around the world. When we try to have a Zoom call, it's one of the hardest things imaginable because we have someone in almost every single time zone. So you're trying to get New Zealand, Germany, West Coast US, East Coast US, and India, and Tokyo all at the same time. And it's very interesting to be a part of that group. I also am recently a published author, so you can find the article that I posted for the Cutter Business Technology Journal at tinyurl.com/dropagile. And that's there. So as you can probably see, I enjoy provocative titles. Find me an email, jeff@jeffdoolittle.com, and on the web at jeffdoolittle.com. So let's start. What are our goals for this evening? Yes, I love the Commodore 64 chat. I still wish I had one. If any of you have one, it'd be fun to have a little Commodore 64 hackathon. I just have two goals for this evening. And basically, I love thinking through things, and I've been bitten so many times in my past by not thinking through things and not considering what's really going on behind the scenes, that now I'm sort of allergic to not thinking things through. And of course, that can lead to too much thinking. But hopefully tonight we'll do just a bit of thinking. And ultimately, what I want you to do is recognize that you need to avoid the pit of despair. You know the pit I mean. Every software developer's eyes glaze over at the sheer technological overload and complexity of the systems that they build and manage. Maybe it's something you inherited, maybe it's something you built and you're ashamed to admit, or maybe you just contributed as part of a team, but you get to that point where you recognize, some people maybe call it the death march, or they just call it complexity explosion, but whatever you might call it, we all want to avoid, I hope, the pit of despair. And I don't think anybody ends up there on purpose, but we find ourselves slowly over time migrating that way. And the reality is nobody oops their way to a successful software system. It takes discipline, it takes practice, and it takes people who know what they're doing and learn quickly. I love what Neil Ford said in his book, The Productive Programmer. He said, developers are drawn to complexity like moths to a flame, often with the same outcome. And you can find out more about Neil at joyofcoding.org. So when you find yourself there in that pit of despair, and I'd ask for a raise of hands, but I can barely see any of you. Most of your screen's hidden. But I think I'm probably not the only one who's found myself in that pit of despair before. And in my early days, often that was even from my own devising. So your best hope if you end up in the pit of despair is that you just end up mostly dead. Because if you're all dead, there's really not much more that we can do for you. Perhaps you won't be physically dead, but dead on the inside. Maybe you've been to that place in your career. Or you've seen those engineers with the eyes glazed over, resigned to a fate of coupling and complexity, and there's little hope for escape. So that's goal number one. Let's avoid the pit of despair. Number two, think for yourself. I hope that your goal is to never stop learning. I hope your goal is to never stop challenging the conventional wisdom or what you think you know. Provocative titles for me are more of a way to challenge people's thinking than they are to actually convey what I truly think. And my goal is more to spur conversation and get people looking for answers. I'm much less interested in telling you what you should do. I'm far more interested in giving you an exploration space that you can begin to just expand your thinking. And sometimes that comes from going to the depths of what we think we already know. And sometimes it takes looking at new things entirely. So I know a lot of you probably think this, but I see enough times that people fall into this trap. So hopefully you don't settle for what a vendor sells you. And hopefully you don't settle for what a colleague tells you. You need to keep validating what you're here. And like I said, mostly I want to get you asking questions. And I would really love to continue this conversation as well, even after our time together this evening. It's always interesting to see how people respond to things like this. So let's dive in. REST, Rex, microservices. Woo! There's your cue again, Rich. You know, you got to like shake your, yeah, that's it. That's it. All right. So I want to start by just recognizing that even some of the words in this sentence, they require us to recognize the shoulders of giants that we stand upon as software engineers. So if you're going to talk about REST and microservices, there's a few names that you should know. I'm wondering if anyone here has heard of Roy Fielding before, as it pertains to the idea of REST. Or maybe you've heard of Peter Rogers and Yuval Lowy as it pertains to microservices. Or one of the more recent experts on microservices is a gentleman named Michael Monty Montgomery. These people have been wrestling with, both as practitioners and theoreticians, for decades about REST and microservices. And there are many other luminaries and names that we could take a look at, that we could research, that we could find out. But I'm just going to focus a little bit on them tonight and try to help us expand our minds, avoid the pit of despair, and see where it takes us. So REST and microservices. You keep using those words. I do not think they mean what you think they mean. So this is our friend Inigo Montoya, and he will be our tour guide this evening as we navigate the stormy waters of software systems. If you haven't noticed yet, meaning matters. If you're going to use the words, it might be good to know what they mean. And if you don't, Inigo is here to say, you killed my, well, I guess you didn't kill his father, but you know, prepare to die. So let's use the words maybe the way they're meant to be used.
I do like the repeated theme around Princess Bride, so thank you.
Oh, you caught that. Yeah, thanks. Now it's a little too obvious, so thanks for that, Rich. So, REST. There's a nice short link for you. By the way, if you're curious about these URLs, I can post a listing of links after this presentation. No problem at all. So don't worry about typing in https://os/www.ic. Oh my gosh, dear Lord, that's huge. This is a link to the original dissertation that Roy Fielding wrote and published, I believe in 2008, about REST. Now, what's interesting about REST is my understanding is that REST was not meant to be prescriptive. That what was actually going on is Roy was observing the way the web worked and the architectural patterns that were emerging from the web, and he was describing the way the web worked. And his description was boiled down to this phrase, representational state transfer. That's what the web was doing. It was representing state and transferring it from one system to another. Now, I went through his paper and I tried to find a quote that would be a helpful summary, but this paper is highly technical and extremely academic. I do encourage you to read it for yourself and draw your own conclusions. But let's just say you haven't heard of Roy and you haven't heard of Hate OS. If that's the case, then you are actually unclear on what REST means. Who here has heard of Hate OS before? Hate OS does not mean you hate your operating system, okay? By the way, I'm running on a Mac. I'm a .NET guy, but I love my Mac. I have two MacBooks. One's my personal, one's my work one. But if you're a Windows guy or a Mac guy, this isn't about hating the other person's OS. Or if you're a Linux fan, you know, Alpine Linux for the win. So let's take a look at a summary from Roy, from the ever so summarizing place that we all know and love to hate, Twitter. So a conversation began a while back, and someone tweeted the following: I agree that the popular understanding of the term REST is different from the way @Fielding defined it in his thesis. And this is how Roy replies: I disagree that the popular understanding of the term is different. What is different is the desire of certain companies, authors, and speakers to say REST when they know it is just HTTP. Not because they don't know the meaning of the term, but because $, meaning. Those are not bit shift operators, by the way. Those are, I think, double greater thans. Roy Fielding. And there's a link to that tweet from the illustrious Roy. What's he saying here? Sounds like he's saying dollars trump understanding. Sounds like he's saying dollars matter more than meaning, at least to some people. And here's the sad reality: as we try to avoid the pit of despair, and we try to think for ourselves, and we try to make sure that we don't offend our friend Inigo, and we actually learn about the words that we're using. The question you need to ask yourself is this: who benefits from such confusion of meaning? There's a lot of money to be made in confusion. Present politicians aside, there's a lot of money to be made in confusion. And Roy pointed that out. So here's Roy talking about what REST is. He, in that tweet stream, didn't really say what it is. So he's saying a little bit more about what it is. And Roy says, I'm getting frustrated by the number of people calling any HTTP-based interface a REST API. Now let's stop there for a second. I hope most of our listeners and attendees today know what an HTTP-based interface is, but just in case you don't, if you're using ASP.NET Core, or you're using any kind of web server to communicate with systems outside your network or even inside your network, if you're using that is most likely that you're using the HTTP protocol. Now it's possible that you can be using gRPC with ASP.NET Core, or you can be using WebSockets with something like SignalR, but it's pretty common that people are using HTTP-based interfaces and calling it a REST API. They've got gets, they've got puts, they've got posts, and they've got deletes. And please don't say those reflect CRUD in a CRUD domain, because they don't, and that's a presentation for another day. Roy continues, today's example is, and he names some API that was out there at the time. And he says that API that he's referring to is RPC, which means remote procedure call. Now, RPC is not necessarily bad, but RPC can do something specific to you. And here's Roy's take. It screams RPC. There is so much coupling on display that it should be given an X rating. If the engine of application state, and hence the API, is not being driven by hypertext, then it cannot be RESTful and cannot be a REST API. Now this leaves us with a really interesting dilemma, and smart people might disagree on this or agree on this. Is JSON hypertext? Well, shoot, that's a whole nother rabbit trail you'd have to go down to determine what you mean by hypertext. I believe when Roy says hypertext, he actually means hypertext. And going back to what I mentioned before, that Roy was describing the web as it functioned, not prescribing, at least in the beginning, not prescribing a way that systems should behave. That isn't to say he doesn't now prescribe things, but I'm saying that in his original thesis, it appears to me, from my understanding, that the goal was to describe the way things work. So let's highlight the things that seem important to Roy here. One, there's so much coupling on display. Now, is coupling bad or is coupling good? During COVID-19, is coupling bad or, anyway. Okay, so Aaron says bad. Anyone else? Coupling, good or bad? Yeah, type it in the chat. Bad, bad, bad. Anyone else? Does anyone think coupling is good? Oh, I like that answer. Can you build a system without coupling? Not really. Yeah, so you can't really build a system without coupling, but too much coupling is probably a problem, right? Even in the real world, too much coupling is probably going to get you in trouble with some of the couples that you couple with. So just enough coupling to do the job and zero more. That's right. And I figured that's what you were saying, Aaron, even though you said bad before. Yes, so there's an X rating coupling, and then maybe we want to go for the G rating, right? I mean, you might have a PG system, that's okay. Let's not even talk about a PG-13 rated coupling in your system, but We want to avoid unnecessary coupling, and we want to avoid strong coupling between services. That seems like a good goal. The next thing he refers to is the engine of application state. Now, this is very interesting. I'm sure that in your experience, and I've seen it in mine, you have seen times where the engine of application state does not actually reside within the API. Has anyone seen this before? Like maybe, I don't know, if you did web forms back in the day, did anybody just die with state that was being transmitted back and forth between the web browser and the server, and eventually would fall over and cave and blow up in your face? So that was definitely not keeping the application state back in the system where, according to Roy, it seems to belong. How about modern systems today? Is it possible that we're allowing application state to leak out to our wonderful TypeScript Angular applications and that we're maintaining that state? As Aaron says, setters and getters for all our objects and web methods, that will be totally awesome. Exactly, that'd be awesome. That's exactly what we want. It makes it easy, it's fast, it's simple. In fact, if you search the internet for examples of how to do this, I guarantee you'll find exactly what Aaron just referred to as, a model for what you should do. Maybe not, just some person's blog post saying, well, I did this and it worked. And hopefully copy paste from the internet and, code by whatever, GitHub gists or our old favorite code. Oh, I just forgot what it's called. Help me, Rich. Code, the one that we love to mock. Never mind, I'll move on. So yeah.
Code project?
Yes, that's the one. Thank you. Yes. Please don't
get to the mute button fast enough.
Yes. Please stop copy pasting from code project and putting that in your project. So engine of application state can leak out regardless, right? So are you RESTful? Are you not? Is it REST? Is it not? It seems to me that these are the important things according to Roy. Oh yeah, I know. We all do. We've all, but look, I could tell you war stories about me doing it wrong so many times. One of the only reasons I finally figured out how to do it right is because I did it wrong so many times. Now, I know a few people who learned how to do it right from the beginning and have done it right almost their entire careers. I know that sounds absolutely unbelievable. I've met them, they exist, they're real, and we can learn from them. They are few, but they do exist. But some of us have had to earn our battle scars. So let's talk about hate OS. This is something else I mentioned a little bit ago. If you haven't heard of Roy Fielding and you haven't heard of hate OS, then I guarantee you are not doing REST. You're not. You are not doing REST if you're not doing hate OS. So hate OS means hypermedia as the engine of application state. Let me go back to the previous slide. I want you to see something very important here. The second line of orange text, engine of application state. So we've seen Mr. Fielding, Dr. Fielding, I don't know, Roy, saying previously a lot about engine of application state. And he also claims that you're not doing REST if hypertext is not representing the state of your application. Okay, so hate OS is basically a summary of what REST was intending to accomplish. It is hypermedia as the engine of application state. With hate OS, a client interacts with a network application whose application servers provide information dynamically through hypermedia. Now that's an interesting twist there. We could discuss whether hypermedia and hypertext are the same thing and whether a JSON-based API can be considered hypermedia, but we'll leave that discussion for another time. A REST client needs little to no prior knowledge about how to interact with an application or server beyond a generic understanding of hypermedia. Now stop there for a minute. That's a fascinating point that he makes. A REST client needs little to no prior knowledge about how to interact with an application or server beyond a generic understanding of hypermedia. I'll just jump to the punchline here. There are very few client applications that understand how to interact with an API in this fashion. And there are very few APIs that function in this manner. What it's basically saying is you have a single URL that is an entry point to your entire API, and you know nothing about any other links or resources or anything about that API other than that entry point. And you discover everything from that initial entry point, and it tells you everything you need to know to navigate from there. To build an API that allows you to do this can get very complicated. The funny thing is you do it all the time and you don't even know it. It's called an HTML application over a web browser. If you're doing server-side rendering of an HTML application and you are serving up hypertext and you have a single entry point to your application called your homepage, and if it properly links to everything within that domain, you have a REST application. That's REST. If you have a JSON API and every time you want to expose new functionality to your end users or your clients, and they have to check your documentation to see what new routes and what new URLs are available, you don't have a REST client. You don't have a REST API. You just don't. Now, is that good or bad? I don't know. Depends. I'll leave that up to you. But we'll get into a little bit more about what REST has become and why REST does in fact wreck microservices. But the summary says the restrictions imposed by Hate OS, it's just fun to say Hate OS. Like I don't miss Windows. Hate OS, decouple client. Well, I miss recent versions. Old versions I don't miss. Anyone miss Windows 3.1.1 for workgroups? I mean, seriously? The restrictions imposed by Hate OS decouple client and server. There's that thing again about decoupling. Coupling, is it good or bad? Well, it depends. And you got to have some of it. I mean, the client has to talk to the server at some point, unless you have a completely client-only app. This enables server functionality to evolve independently. Now, this is new. This is a new concept to layer into what I'm talking about here. Doesn't this sound like the Holy Grail? Isn't this what we all want? And I would say not even just server functionality. We want services, we want classes, we want everything. Yes, thank you, Aaron. So much versioning, but it is what we want. The means to get there, is it versioning? Is it new SDKs all the time? Is it something else you can conceive of? But we definitely want this. We want the ability for the services to evolve independently. And Hate OS says that it enables that. So maybe we should do Hate OS. Maybe we should chase REST and make that our goal in life, is we're gonna not just be RESTful, but we're gonna do a full Hate OS REST implementation. Well, there's some problems with REST. Thank you. Yes, REST, that's microservices. We're going to chase REST. This was the running, Rich. This is what you're supposed to do. There's the running. So maybe you've had some of these problems with REST. And by the way, right now I'm talking about REST the way it's commonly done, not necessarily REST the way that Roy Fielding described that the web works. Here's an example. Despite the promise, you often end up coupled to technologies. But wait, REST was supposed to decouple us from technologies. Okay, but does every client and every server prevent any leakage of any knowledge of the technologies that you're using on either side of the wire from being beknownst to either side of the wire? Maybe. Very often, no. And honestly, you'd only really know if you had two implementations of each, and you could validate that the exact same interface, and by interface here, I don't mean public interface C# style. I just mean the mechanism you use to access the thing. You end up coupled to technologies. Maybe you end up coupled to them in the way you serve things from your system. How about this? Despite the promise, you often end up coupled to tools and tooling, but we have Swagger code gen, so we're great. We open API declare metadata on every single endpoint in our system. And then we just run a Swagger gen and everything's great. And it doesn't matter if there's new endpoints or all this stuff, that's all just kind of whisked away. But did we ever stop to ask ourselves why we need a tool like SwaggerGen to reduce the amount of complexity or hide and shield from us the amount of complexity that's going on? By the way, SwaggerGen is not a silver bullet. It takes work. It takes time. You have to think. You can't just run SwaggerGen, wipe your hands and say, I have a public API. I can hand out a C# and a Ruby and a R and a whatever the hot language is now. If you want to avoid the pit of despair and you want to think for yourself, that is. If you don't, then by all means, run SwaggerGen, publish it out, and you're good to go. How about this? Despite the promise, you often end up coupled to transports and protocols. Oh, we're using HTTP 1. Okay, what happens when HTTP 2 comes out? Will Microsoft just handle it for you? Is there some reason you need HTTP 2? Maybe, maybe not. But maybe these are questions we should be answering. What happens with gRPC when that comes out? What if we've ended up with business logic right at the edge of our system, where the only concern should be plumbing and not logic? Has this ever happened to anyone? You've seen the examples. I remember back in 2000, I want to say 6, when ASP.NET MVC pre-release beta was coming along. And there were some really great guys, Rob Connery, Phil Hack, Scott Hanselman, who some of you might know. And they were doing Microsoft development differently. They were building out in the open, and it was great. And the company that I was a CTO of adopted it right away. And it was really great. Here was the problem. A lot of people started posting code examples, code project, again, or wherever, whatever the place was to post stuff back then. It definitely wasn't SourceForge. No Microsoft developer ever posted anything to SourceForge. But the examples very often would show you controller, method, business logic, database, done. Spit it all out and you move on. So how do you feel about that? It seems kind of painful, especially when you want to shift over now to the new hotness of ASP.NET Core 3 point, whatever they're on now. And you want to adopt all the cool latest routing conventions that they have. By the way, routing conventions, look, if you're building a small app, they're great. If you're building a massive application, you may want to rethink the way that you're routing things. And if you couple your routing mechanism to the services that are behind them, guess what you've just done? You've done some unnecessary coupling. Maybe the services should be pluggable into different protocols and different transports and different tools and tooling and technologies instead of the other way around. But we'd love to let the vendors tell us how to do things. And so they show us their examples. And no knock on Phil and Scott and Rob and all those guys. They did great work. The knock is on the next step. It's marketing gets a hold of it. It's people get a hold of it and they start showing you their examples. And they're just meant to get you started. By the way, those people may not even have malintent. Some might, but most probably don't. But then people see it, they say, this is the way to do it. And then they start doing that because they didn't stop to say, how can I avoid the pit of despair? And they didn't stop to think for themselves. And it's not even the worst of it yet. Worse yet, you end up with massive coupling between your clients and the APIs you publish. One thing you experience is what I call endpoint proliferation. Anybody see this before? You expose a RESTful API to the world. And let's say you don't even expose it to the world. You expose it to your inside front-end development team. And you must love to give pain to your front-end development team, because I've literally worked on this team before. Not either of the companies where I was CTO, but a small stint that I've had in the last season of time, and the company will remain unnamed. Literally every time there needed to be a new lookup or a new interaction between the client Angular application and the back-end API, a new endpoint had to be generated, and both sides of the wire had to do a bunch of work to figure out what was the interaction going to be. And then they both had to deploy together, or you deploy the system first and put the API out there, and then you deploy that after, but you're having to do this massive amount of work every time you want to just get a simple bit of change out there for the front end. Why are we doing that? Why do we end up with thousands upon thousands of endpoints with thousands upon thousands of routes? And then we say, well, okay, but I'll generate the Swagger docs and then I'm fine. Did we ever stop to say, why do we need all this complexity to shield us from all the complexity that we created for ourselves? And maybe we didn't need all that complexity in the first place. Maybe we're still in the pit of despair. We think we've gotten out. You know, I mean, we were told, don't even think about trying to escape, but we're just there. We're just there. All this reliance on complicated tooling to get us out of what actually might be a simple problem. Maybe there's other ways to avoid endpoint proliferation. And maybe we don't need complicated tooling to let us embrace a practice that we shouldn't have embraced in the first place. Now, is any of this REST's fault? No, of course not. Just like what Agile has become is not the fault of the people who originally came up with the idea of Agile. Although those questions I would ask about whether what they came up with was even the thing we should be following. And if you want more about that, you can go read my recent publication for the Cutter Business Technology Journal, which I linked before and I'll link again later. But it isn't necessarily REST's fault. Anytime we adopt something and we don't think deeper about it, it's going to lead to pain. Evolution has taught us this, right? There's a reason that we shy away from certain things when we're walking outside, things that scare us. Snakes, you know, we chafe, we jump, we run. Some people love snakes, but the vast majority of people have an aversive reaction to snakes. You know, there's certain kinds of berries or certain kinds of colors that we sort of, you know, pull away from. Why? Well, because it was to our evolutionary advantage to avoid those things. And yet for some reason in software land, we don't always stop and take the evolutionary cues that are right before us, waving their arms saying, vendor lock-in. Of course, you can over-engineer to avoid vendor lock-in, but that's a topic for another day. Or they're screaming, it's easy, look, we have this tool. Don't worry about all the complexity. Just keep doing it that way and we'll cover over the complexity. I find it interesting that in the early days of MVC, ASP.NET MVC and other systems that came after that, you were really shielded from the knowledge of what was actually happening on the wire. Anybody remember these days? In fact, the team worked really, really hard to make an HTTP context base. Anybody remember this? You can say something in the comments or raise your hand or whatever. And they worked really hard to make all of these abstractions over those objects. Do we still do that today? They redid all the abstractions because you know what was going on? HTTP context base was trying to shield you from a ton of complexity that didn't need to exist. And a few years went by and somebody came up with this glorious idea called OWIN. It's the Open Web Internet Standard. And it was an interface, set of interfaces, but I don't mean interfaces in the way you mean interfaces. I don't mean C# interfaces. It was actually a bunch of delegate signatures for how the web worked. Come on, we wanted a click event from the browser we can respond to on a server. Well, then Blazor is your friend. Yeah, well, we'll talk about, again, Blazor, another talk for the day. Where was I? Oh, yes, HTTP context base. So notice now that you're a lot closer to the metal than you used to be. Has anyone noticed this? You're a lot closer to the bare metal than you used to be in a lot of these frameworks. And that's actually a good thing. Because if you know what's happening on the wire, you're much less likely to have your leg blown off when something unanticipated happens. I remember early in my career, there was a tool called Coolplex, and it ran on a IBM AS400 using a programming language called RPG. And the promise of this was that you could use this tool and you could create a pattern and it would generate your entire system for you. And it didn't matter what your backend database was. It didn't matter what language you were programming in. It could generate stored procedures, C++, C#, VB.NET, Java, you name it, COBOL even, all from your pattern. And I remember the wonderful situation that occurred where the team that said, we don't need to worry about what's happening with the database. You know, this will handle everything for us. And they had a catastrophic failure in their SQL Server and they didn't know what to do because nobody on their team knew how to manage SQL Server. So hiding complexity from yourself, dangerous. Yes, and there are definitely people looking for COBOL programmers right now. So not necessarily Rest's fault, but we like to chase things like that. So here's our friend Inigo Montoya once again, reminding us to think about the words we use and what they mean. To rest or not to rest? Well, should you or shouldn't you? It depends. Is HTTP the right protocol for the situation at hand? I don't know. What do you think? Will the benefits of hate OS outweigh the complexities and difficulties of implementation? Maybe, maybe not. I would challenge anybody to build a easy to build hate OS system other than the nature of the way the web just already works. Should you worry about it? Again, it depends. What are you really trying to achieve? What Roy Fielding was guiding us to achieve was loosely coupled, independently evolving services. That's the goal. And here we have a Neil Ford quote, compliments of Aaron. You must be this tall to ride. Applies to REST, applies to microservices as well. Yes, and given that, that's a good time. Maybe we should switch to, speaking of services, let's talk about microservices. Ooh. So we used to have this thing called components. Does anybody remember Corba? Common Object Broker Architect, I can't, bleh. Corba was Java's answer to COM. Did anyone here program in COM or COM+? Back in the 90s? Little bit, okay. If you're not aware, .NET is basically COM. Now it's changed significantly with .NET Core, but the .NET Standard Framework is basically still running on COM. It's COM objects. And what was COM trying to do? Well, it was trying to basically say, let's make classes that have interfaces and they encapsulate behavior and they encapsulate state. Yes, not to be confused with Cobra. In fact, there is a programming language called Cobra, which is a fun little fact. And under the covers, it transpiles to C#. I don't even know if it's still around, but I remember fiddling around with it back in the, I don't know, late 2000s, early 2010s or something like that. What are we supposed to call it? Is it the 20-aughts or the aughts? I don't know. Like, what do we, the 2000s, whatever. So back to microservices. And I mentioned that because back then, the whole goal was to try to create decoupled, independently evolving services. This has been a goal for a very, very long time in our industry. As is said in the book of Ecclesiastes, there truly is nothing new under the sun. Aaron, you got to stop distracting me, man. Okay. So microservices. So we had services and services talk to services. When did we come up with this idea of microservices? And what makes a service micro? Is the next big thing in technology nanoservices? Is it picoservices? Is it what's next? Femtoservices? Yada services? Zeta, Sada, Zeta, I don't know, whatever. All the way down, what's next? It's an interesting question to ask. What makes a service a microservice? Well, first, thanks Inigo, I don't know, Inigo Montoya. We should go back and actually ask where the word came from. So there's a wonderful Wikipedia article on microservices. And if you jump down to the history anchor, the first thing you see is that a gentleman named Peter Rogers, one of the names I mentioned before, he was against the whole SOAP and SOA approach to things. And he proposed something he called REST services. Now, I don't know Peter Rogers and I don't know what he meant, but it is interesting to me that he called them REST services. And his hope was that there would be services that were serviceable to call any other service. Is that good or bad? I guess it depends. I mean, if any service can call any service, does that sound like loose coupling or a whole lot of coupling? Yeah, I'll leave that to you. 2007, a gentleman named Yuval Lowy, who is one of the few, I think about 6 or 7 people that Microsoft has named a software legend. Yuval Lowy came up with this concept that's called every class a service. Now this sounds terrifying, but here's what he says. I never called these services microservices. Then as now, I did not think the microservices concept existed. There are no microservices, only services. Considering what I just told you about COM, that sounds really interesting. Now, every class of service, maybe that sounds painful. And done incorrectly, it certainly would be painful. But Yuval recently came out with a book called Writing Software, and there's a link there to writingsoftware.org. And he says something really interesting in there to kind of help us with this idea of what's a microservice versus a service. Here's his example. It's wonderful. He says, your car has a small water pump. Perhaps it's an 8-inch long water pump. And then your city has a large water pump. Perhaps it's 8 feet in length. What makes the small one a micro pump versus the large one? He goes on in the book and says, services are services regardless of their size. Or as I would like to say, putting this in the mouth of Dr. Seuss's Horton, the elephant who hears a who, Horton might say, a service is a service no matter how small. And then we have Michael Monty Montgomery, who is a distributed systems expert. And you cannot find his talk, 10 Fallacies of Microservices, on the internet. You have to hear it for yourself in person. And if you do have an opportunity to hear him speak in person about the 10 fallacies of microservices, I highly encourage you to attend. I've looked throughout the internet to see if he has an upcoming virtual version of this. And I wasn't able to find one, but I will reach out to him after this session and hopefully discover if he's planning to do that soon. But recently, Monty shared some documentation from Microsoft regarding microservices with myself and some of our colleagues. And I found this very interesting. This is very recent stuff from Microsoft about microservices. Maybe these diagrams look familiar to you, maybe they don't. Just to give us some context, you see from the not so short URL at the bottom of the page, or is it a URI? Again, we can have that debate another day. URL, URI, URN. This is speaking about architecting microservice container applications. Oh boy, well, what is a microservice, Microsoft? This is basically in the context of helping you understand what the API gateway pattern is. And question, is the API gateway pattern good or is it bad? Hopefully you know the answer by now. Aaron will probably type it there for us. Good or bad? It depends. So you've probably seen this before. What are some problems you see here? I see a few right out of the gate. First thing I think of here is that most likely these microservices are just serving up data, and it's up to the client applications to stitch everything together. Like I mentioned before, those apps that I've worked on before, where you have a back end and you have a front end, but they're completely coupled, and everything new you want to do on the front end, you have to do something new on the back end to match. You get extremely chatty conversations between your front end and your back end, and it's a nightmare. Another problem I see, every new microservice means work must also occur in the client apps for them to benefit. I just kind of mentioned that one. The next one, every change to an existing microservice means changes to the client apps, but what happens is actually far worse. Because we make new microservices, because microservices are awesome. So we make another one and another one and another one. And next thing you know, we have microservice hell. Ah, yes, thank you, Rich. Perfect. He just posted the link to this in the chat.
My fingers are going to ache now from typing that, though.
Oh, well, I could have copy pasted it for you. Sorry. Actually, it's more fun knowing that you had to type it. Has anyone worked in an environment like this before? Has anyone created an environment like this before? What are the constraining principles determining what service should talk to which service? How on earth are you ever going to have independently evolving decoupled services in this kind of an architecture? I don't even like using the word architecture to refer to this. It is absolutely terrifying to me. And yes, I have seen this before. And yes, 15 years ago, I built this before we even really had the concept of microservices in the public sphere. I don't do this anymore. I do still run into it. I do still have to help teams that I work with solve this problem. And it is not an easy problem to solve. So, what guiding principles should you have to determine which microservices can communicate with which other ones? Do you have guidance for what protocols should be used for communicating between microservices? Is REST the answer? Is REST the answer? Can you see my mouse? Yes or no? Good, Rich is nodding. Is REST the answer here? Is REST the answer here? Here, here, here? Do we just assume REST everywhere? Or is REST going to wreck our microservices? Did you know that there's faster transports and protocols available than using a RESTful interface with JSON serialization? Did you know that a race to the bottom for who has the fastest JSON serializer is not the best way to get performance out of your service-to-service communications? There's other things that you can do. But unfortunately, most of these systems end up coupling themselves to the protocol. They end up coupling themselves to the serialization, or the fact that they have to do that kind of serialization. And next thing you know, you find out that REST is wrecking their microservices. Yes, I prefer the way Aaron puts this. I don't like distributed monolith, because that just sounds like, what? That's like a phrase without meaning. But a monolith with network boundaries, I like that. Yes, that's right. You got a big fat monolith inside your network and everything talks to everything. That's a good way of putting it, Aaron. Thank you. Okay, so this is Microsoft's recommendation for how you start to fix this. Pros and cons to this. Is this an improvement? Maybe. I see some improvement. But let me ask you a question. How much is this API gateway doing here? Is it merely load balancing and sending you to the microservice? Is it helping with any notion of handling versioning of those microservices, or is it basically a straight pass-through? In other words, are these applications still directly coupled to the microservices in nefarious, hidden ways? Sure they are. Sure they are. Why do I say that? Because unless you know differently, that's just what's going to end up happening. You do not oops your way into a solid architecture. You don't. You just don't. You have to be aware of these things. So merely the injection of API, and by the way, they're not suggesting that merely the introduction of an API gateway solves all your problems, but people see pretty diagrams and they see code posted on Code Project and they run with it and say, oh yeah, this is what's going to work for us. So that's the risk that I see here, is it still could be very leaky. right? How about this? What lives in the API gateway? Is it a dumb gateway or is it a smart gateway? I mean, if the API gateway has business logic and orchestration logic in it, it's probably better than having it in the client applications, right? Yeah, I'd say that's most likely an improvement. But now what have you done? Well, you put business logic in your API gateway. And if you want to change your API gateway technology, and on and on and on it goes. And we still have no organizing principles for how the services in the backend can or should communicate with each other. It's a little better. I mean, I have a feeling here microservices aren't calling out to the API gateway. Gosh, I hope not. Here's another one. Using multiple API gateways, best friends forever. Does anybody know what that actually means? The prize for tonight, Rich, is going to go to whoever knows what BFF means.
You just, which BFF? Your BFF. I was going back to the one.
Right up here. Best friends forever.
Yeah, no, I was going to the one you actually said, yeah.
What did I actually say?
Best friends forever.
Yeah, right. Does anybody know what it actually means in this context? All right.
I can think of two options for the Fs.
Let's take it easy here. BFF. Back ends for front ends. Ben wins the prize. Yay, Ben. Free whiskey shots, compliments of Rich, if you can find your way to his house and not pass on anything.
And bring your own whiskey.
That's right. Back ends for front ends. So back to the picture. Again, this is just a mild change from what we had before, but this could just be load balancing, right? This could just be load balancing, and we're still coupled directly to the APIs of those microservices. And where's orchestration happening? And where's business logic happening? And all of these things. So again, you're going to run into problems if you just adopt this, because of course, Microsoft has an API gateway technology to offer you. And you have to always ask yourself the question, who's this good for? And follow the money, right? These are old school wisdom that we all have heard, but unfortunately the old school wisdom is often known, but left untried and unapplied. So we still have to think. And if all you're thinking here is that every arrow here is REST, and it's REST as you understand it, not as Roy Fielding understood it, which means that you're also beholden to the whim of your other colleagues who have their own understanding of what REST or RESTful actually means. And we aren't even sure we're saying the same thing. It sounds to me like there lies pain. Because where there's confusion, there's money to be made by people who can shield you from having to worry about the confusion and offer you a tool or something that can make it all go away for you. Best friends forever? Nope. So what were our goals? Avoid a pit of despair. What does a pit of despair look like? Does REST really wreck your microservices? Is that even a meaningful phrase? Are you even doing REST? Is there even any such thing as a microservice? These are the questions I ask myself. These are the reasons I don't get much sleep at night. Ask my wife, she'll tell you. I don't need to tell anybody this, but the irony is, I think we all need to remember this. Richard Feynman, the noted physicist who wrote a wonderful book called Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. He says something very helpful. The first rule is not to be fooled, and you are the easiest person to fool. Anybody hear that before? The first rule is not to be fooled, and you are the easiest person to fool. I'm looking here for an image that I want to show you all because this is a perfect example of what Mr. Feynman was talking about. So speaking of defining our terms, so Dunning and Kruger were researchers, and a lot of people talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect, and they have this idea that, oh yeah, Dunning-Kruger is what happens when you're stupid. It's a little bit more than that. Dunning-Kruger is the propensity for there to be a correlation between low knowledge and high confidence. Okay, get that again. Dunning and Kruger is the propensity for humans with low knowledge or experience to have high confidence. And if you think Dunning-Kruger does not apply to you, then you right now are sitting atop king of the hill of Mount Stupid because it applies to all of us. High confidence, low knowledge. And notice there, what happens next after the peak of Mount Stupid? We experience the valley of despair. And we want to avoid the pit of despair, valley of despair, whatever you want to call it. And then eventually we reach, we hope, the slope of enlightenment, where we reach expertise. And now we can have high confidence that is actually warranted. Here's the funny thing as well. A lot of people that dwell in this area, hopefully you can still see my mouse moving, my little magnifying glass. A lot of people who exist right here, what words do you think might often be used to describe them? Arrogant? Know-it-all? I mean, hopefully they're somewhat humble. Yeah, elite, right? Hopefully not elitist. But if you're right and you know you're right and you have the experience to back it up, it's not arrogance. It's hard-fought confidence based on true expertise. By the way, we live in an industry and a culture that values novelty and youth. And because we value novelty and youth, thank you. Yes, surely you're joking, Rich. You actually have a copy of that book. Although Feynman was standing in front of your Sherman. That's Zoom for you. You might get in trouble for that. So we want to avoid the pit of despair. And I do want to give you permission to think for yourself. I need to give myself that permission over and over again. And I'm reminded again of Feynman's quote. The first rule is not to be fooled, and you, me, are the easiest one to fool. So keep asking questions. Inigo says, if you're going to use the words, know what they mean. Think, avoid the pit of despair. And we'll all be well? No, but hopefully it'll be better than it could have been otherwise. REST, Rex, microservices. Questions? You can unmute.
You can unmute and ask questions or type them or use sign language.
Oh, well, I used to know it, but I'm a little rusty.
I don't think anyone knows it. I mean, you can ask them.
So Jeff, I'll ask a question to get the party started.
Cool.
So great talk. I'm really glad you're kind of talking about the real kind of practical, pragmatic things about how you do this stuff. How do you counsel? Because you're a leader, you're a tech leader, right? You know, how do you counsel people to not be so taken in by what people's natural instinct is to say, hey, I do REST, therefore my architecture is good, or I do, you know, microservices, therefore my architecture is good. And like, there's probably some techniques you probably use to help people understand that that's not all you have to do. Like, you still have to think. You still have to think about architecture. You still have to think about how things couple together, regardless where the trend is. What are some tricks you use to help people think about that in a better way?
Yeah, and I appreciate the request. It's certainly not tricks, right? And I know you're not looking for an easy shortcut, but the word tricks can kind of sound that way. There definitely are not easy shortcuts. It's a constant battle. It is constant. It's constant with myself, and it's constant with people that I interact with. And one of the things that I work on, I also have a master's degree in a practice called transformational leadership. And some of you may have heard of servant leadership before, but this is a little bit different. It involves that, but it's more dynamic. The idea of transformational leadership is that your job is to replicate leadership in others. Now, that doesn't mean you replicate you in others, although elements of what you're good at, you certainly want to replicate in others. But the idea of transformational leadership is that you are seeking to find other people that you can make into leaders. So that's one of the disciplines, I would say, not tricks. And it's the discipline of seeing the leadership potential in everyone, because everyone is leading someone or something. And it's fanning the flame of that, and it's helping it to grow. My tagline on my website is, I help make good software engineers great. And that's right in line with my mission. That is my mission. That's what I'm about. I want to help make good software engineers great. And so I look for people's leadership capacity and propensities, and I fan the flame of that. I also spend a lot of time asking iconoclastic questions. And I love to, you know, get at the underbelly of things and kind of stir it up a little bit. I'm a contrarian by nature. And, you know, I've lost my way a few times, to be honest, in my career. And I find myself now, over 20 years in my career, saying I need to keep that contrarian spirit alive and keep pushing, and just more than anything, start conversations, right? And the Socratic method also helps a lot. Asking them the why questions. Help me understand that. Explain to me that. And some people might chafe at first, So you have to build a safe place, a safe relationship for them, because asking those Socratic questions can make people defensive if you're not careful. But once you build rapport with them and they recognize that you're just as willing to be challenged, that can really help a lot. So for example, for me, I'll invite a small circle of people that I've built some rapport with to join me in reviewing a system design that I've created. And I actually tell them that they have one job to do. Their job is to invalidate the architecture that I'm proposing. Their job is not to validate it. Their job is to invalidate it. And that does a few things. One, it puts me in a subjected role to them. So that's an example of servant leadership, by the way. Servant leadership doesn't mean you get down on your knees and you are their slave. It means you serve them and you put them in a position of influence over you. And so that has this interesting dynamic there. So their job is to invalidate. Of course, I've invalidated it once or twice myself because I do that myself also, but they will invariably find something I've missed, and it's super helpful. So that's another, that's probably, I guess you'd call that almost a trick, but it definitely takes a lot of rapport and a lot of work ahead of time to get you to that point that you can do that. But yeah, that's a fun one actually. And I talk about Karl Popper, who's a philosopher of science, and basically, if you're familiar with the idea of verification and invalidation, he was the one who said, you can't ever actually validate a theory. All you can do is falsify it. And that's true of our theories about our systems. All you can do is say, I have not yet invalidated my system. And that has a beautiful impact on architects who can sometimes be arrogant and know-it-alls. And when you can flip them around and say, challenge your own ideas and then have others challenge your ideas, your goal is to have a hypothesis. And actually your goal is to have it fail as soon as possible before a line of code has been written. That is the best time to fail. So those are a few ideas. Hopefully that helps, Aaron. Other questions?
I'm looking.
I have a question. If I look at other engineering principles, they take far, far less risk than software engineers. It seems that software engineers, every time they get their hands on a project, they have to put in a couple of new things to figure out. 20 years ago, introduction of threads. I was on a project with 100 people. Guess how many threads we got? 100. A total chaos.
Wow.
More recently, microservices were introduced, 20 engineers, 20 microservices. What a chaos. Messages coming all over from all places. It was a mess. So if you build a bridge, you're not going to try to come up with 20 new technologies and see what happens on the, well, somebody else pays for it. So I would like to ask you, wouldn't it be better if we engineers just used what we already knew and used new technologies sparingly? And so wouldn't it be the question to ask, why microservices at all?
That is a wonderful question to ask, Mark. And again, back to my even previous question is, are there even such a thing as microservices? You know, I quote Morpheus there and say, there are no microservices, right? Just like there is no spoon.
But what's wrong with the front end and the back end and that working together?
You know what? The answer to that question is, it depends, right? And if your situation, in fact, I would even say server-side rendering. Why not? What's wrong with server-side rendering? In fact, why not render static content? You know, for my personal website, which is just my personal website, but I evaluated the options and I made a GitHub Pages page with liquid templates, and it's faster than fast because it's running on GitHub. You know, so I could have, I'm going to spin up an ASP.NET Core website and this and that, and I'm going to have Razor pages and I'm going to do all this stuff and all this complexity and blah, 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 blah. And I said, no, it's not worth it. So it's not even client server. It's just static HTML. And if I want to update my website, I open up Visual Studio Code, I edit some markdown files, maybe a little bit of SAS, CSS, but it compiles with CSS. And then I do a, git add all, git commit -am message, and I push, and it publishes, and it's wonderful. So there is nothing wrong with that, Mark, knowing what we know and using what we know, as long as it solves the problem at hand. And that's where sometimes it is going to make sense to explore the new thing. But that should be done, you mentioned engineering. I think that's a good example, right? Engineers do sometimes explore new things, but they do it in a confined environment that reduces risk. And to put a capstone on that right there, and back to Aaron's question from before, software engineers have a fundamental problem. and I've been guilty of it as well. Even though I was a business major, we don't learn to speak the language of management. And we expect them to learn our language, and we get frustrated when they don't. And one of my goals in helping make good software engineers great is helping them understand that the best way to solve that problem is for us to solve it and not expect management to come around. And one of the ways to do that is to start learning to speak the language of risk.
Can I add something to that, Jeff?
Sure.
Because I've been loud all day and it won't stop. But like, I think there's a good analogy I can use, which is we want to build resilient systems. At the end of the day, we want to build systems that can like resist, like when changes happen, the blast radius when I make a change to one service and a large collection of services. You know, I want to make sure that doesn't like break everything.
That's right.
The promise of microservices was we could isolate changes to a part of the system. Where we failed was we thought that network boundaries would protect us. And then we built all sorts of, you know, interaction and coupling between network boundaries. And
Okay.
We lost you for a second, Aaron.
Yeah, your audio's off, Aaron.
He's not muted, but we can't hear him.
Aaron. He's speaking so much. And it's
Yeah,
off.
I know. We lost him.
actually being able to, like, and you can do it. But here's the irony. You can do it in a monolith too. You don't need a microservice to do it. You could segment your code base and say between classes, maybe I should be looking at my coupling between classes in the first place, right? And you can get a lot of those benefits without fucking introducing, excuse my French, introducing network boundaries just to pretend that like a network boundary makes me unable to couple. That's
right. Well,
you
there's
know,
there's something else sorely lacking. Mark mentioned engineering, and our industry is moving more and more away from having test engineers. And I think that's a tragedy. In fact, test engineering, really, it's changed names now. It does still exist, and it's considered the realm of the very large company. And I would say that probably the best example you have of test engineering today would be chaos monkeys, chaos engineering. And when you do that, when you do true chaos engineering, the basic idea is you inject chaos into your system at random and watch how it behaves. And then you watch what those stressors are, and you come up with strategies and ways to accommodate those stressors. The chaos monkeys at Netflix, my understanding is they have permission to bring down an entire AWS region. And Netflix must respond and still stream your videos, especially when you're stuck at home because COVID-19, right? But even without chaos engineers, and to your point, Aaron, absolutely. If you have a monolith, that's just a deployment. Well, it isn't just. You have to split up what you mean by monolith. By monolith, do we mean monolith in deployment, or do we mean monolith in implementation? And most of us, when we think monolith in implementation, we think spaghetti code, right? We think a nightmare. But you can have spaghetti strewn across your network, across different services too, if you don't, have proper cohesion and deal with that. So anyway, that's what we got to deal with. But test engineering, that's what I was really aiming for there. What with test engineering, and I do mean like black box testing, right? You say, here's the interface to this system, here's how it should behave, and then they just try to break it 50 million different ways. The beauty of that now, to Mark's point, is this gives you the ability to now try new things. And you can actually watch how the system behaves. Now you still have to be careful, because the larger your system gets, you start entering the complex realm. And there's a gentleman named Dave Snowden who's created something called the Cynefin framework. And I'll type it in here because it's a Welsh word and it's really hard to find if you don't know how to say it. And in his framework, he basically talks about 5 different domains that we find ourselves in: the ordered, which is the simple one, the complicated, the complex, the chaotic, and then the disordered. And systems tend to move, along the spectrum of those different areas. But a lot of times what we think is complicated is actually complex. And the more interactions you add to the different parts of your system, the more you're bordering on complex. And now the difficulty becomes even the best test engineering isn't going to be enough to save you from a complicated domain. There are other techniques that you're going to have to embrace and learn in order to be able to handle a system in a complex domain. But that's a whole nother topic for another day. And I wouldn't be the one to speak on it either. There's a gentleman named Barry O'Reilly in Sweden who's becoming the expert on anti-fragile software architecture systems. Yeah, I like the blast radius. In fact, the book I mentioned before, Writing Software by Yuval Lowy, he actually has a picture you'd like, Aaron. He has a bunch of vaults. And the idea is this vault contains the grenade and only that vault explodes and then everything else is shielded. Just exactly what you were referring to. Any other questions before we wrap it up? Good discussion, everybody.
All right.
All right. Well, in case you have trouble finding me, these are all the places out on the interwebs that you can find me. So yeah, you shouldn't have any trouble finding me. Basically, if you just go to jeffdoolittle.com, you can find everything else there. I do post
your own Stack Overflow, your own LinkedIn. You don't use theirs.
I don't understand why more people don't do this. So if you want to know more about this, I could do a whole talk on this. Your personal brand says a lot about you, and it just opens up a lot of doors for you. Consistency and things of that nature are really good. And these are just redirects. But it's so much easier than me having to remember again, dang it, do I have to put a /Jeff or because, you know, LinkedIn, it had to screw it up. It couldn't just be /Jeff Doolittle. This way I'm just like, forget it. It's my domain, GitHub, my domain, LinkedIn, my domain. And this is all GitHub pages. It's super simple. You make a little redirect template and it just goes, and it sends everybody where they need to go. Yeah.
Very good.
So that's me. Please do go download. By the way, just a quick plug for my recently published article, Don't Disrupt Agile, Drop It. For a limited time at that URL, you can actually download the article for free. And basically what will happen is you'll click on the link to go download and it'll look like a gated access, but the only thing you have to do is check the privacy policy. They basically don't want you to redistribute the download, but you don't have to put in any other information other than checking on the privacy policy. And Cutter definitely puts out some really compelling work. So I'd encourage you also to look at the rest of what that journal has to offer, but please do go to tinyurl.com/drop-agile. And I'd love your feedback on that as well. So
excellent.
That's it.
Let me unmute everybody so that we can all say thank you, woo, and all that kind of thing. Woo.
Hey.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks,
Next
Jeff.
time I present, I'll have some code to share.
And that's probably a year or two from now. But no, I'm kidding.
I do still write a lot of code. I just, can't always show it in public.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording and we can have afterwards like we did last month if folks want.
Nice.
That sounds great.
Might have to grab a beer first.
You didn't already